Hello, this is Paul Saunders again from the Center for the National Interest with my Three Questions podcast. Thank you for listening today. I'm really pleased to be with another of my center colleagues, Martha Miller. Martha is our senior fellow for alliances and emerging threats, which hopefully are not the same thing, Martha. You know, but in all seriousness, kind of like very important issues. And Martha's looking a lot at kind of the Baltic, Nordic, and Arctic regions and some of the challenges that we and our allies face there, and has really a very impressive background at the White House, at the State Department, and also up on Capitol Hill working on these issues. So Martha, thank you very much for being with me today.
Thanks for having me.
You've done a lot of work kind of in your career, including in your prior role at the National Security Institute at George Mason University on these questions of kind of undersea infrastructure and the security aspects of that. And I think for many of us who are kind of quote unquote inside the beltway, this is something that we like talk and think about a lot. I'm not sure that other people talk about it and think about it to quite the same extent. And actually, that's kind of a good thing, in the sense that as long as everything is working properly, there's kind of not really a need to talk about it. But maybe just as a departure point for people who aren't following issues like that on a regular basis, what kind of infrastructure is there that's underwater in the Baltic region? Why does that matter? What difference does it make to anybody?
Great question. And I think it's certainly not something that people are talking about at the dinner table here in the United States. Why would they? As long as everything is working, then you wouldn't really need to. But, when most people picture the Baltic Sea, they think about ships or maybe some naval exercises. But the real significance is what's
And
beneath the
fishing,
water. And
herring,
fishing, yes, thank
herring.
you.
Sorry.
But yes, fishing as well. But the strategic significance is what lies underneath. So, there are three major categories. First, telecommunication cables. These are like fiber optic cables. They carry the majority of international data traffic, not from the Baltic itself, but undersea cables writ large across the globe carry, 99% of the what we have on the internet. So that includes financial flows, cloud services. Cloud services are actually in these cables, not into clouds. Business communications. So the digital economy is literally physically anchored to the seabed with these cables. Then we have electricity interconnectors, so high voltage power cables that connect national grids across the region of the Baltic Sea. And these links helps to, stabilize supply and allow countries to trade electricity. And obviously, in the current environment, they're also tied to energy independence and market stability. And then we have gas pipelines, the Baltic Connector pipeline and what was the Nord Stream line demonstrated that, subsea energy infrastructure can quickly move from, technical asset to a geopolitical flashpoint. And, the Baltic is shallow, it's crowded, and it's, as I just outlined, it's infrastructure dense. So it sits at a strategic crossroads between NATO countries and Russia's route to the Atlantic. So it's not abstract. It's actually the backbone of regional energy, digital connectivity, and economic stability.
I think that gives a really good sense of perspective. And I guess the next question is then kind of like, what are the risks or challenges, or, why, to the extent that Americans should be thinking about this, what should they be thinking about, worried about? You mentioned Russia. You mentioned Nord Stream pipeline, which many may recall, was blown up, I guess, a couple of years ago now. I'm not exactly remembering when that occurred, but it was a while ago now. I'm not watching this like every day like you are, but I know there have been some kind of questions about some of the Chinese shipping in the Baltic and people dragging their anchors along the bottom of the sea. What's going on? What are the risks and threats to this infrastructure?
First of all, there's just routine accidents, right? Fishing equipment can damage cables. There's weather shifts. There are things that happen that are just the par for the course for normal maritime activity. However, what's happened since 2022 had Russian aggression against Ukraine. You have Finland and Sweden joining NATO. And so the strategic calculus changed with that invasion of Ukraine for countries in the Baltic in particular. What we've seen in the Baltic and to some extent also in the South China Sea as a separate but related topic is repetition involving, vessels operating and there being damage to the cables that have been suspected as deliberate state-sponsored sabotage. They've dragged anchors across long stretches of seabed and damaging telecom cables and power links. Some of the vessels have been tied to the shadow fleet activity. These are ships operating with opaque ownership, and they're often evading sanctions and have questionable insurance structures. There are several instances where Finland actually has boarded ships. Crews have been detained and investigations launched, but it's very difficult to prove intent. And that's where things do get held up when it comes to actually prosecuting these infractions. But it's a pattern, and it's when you have these repeated disruptions coming from ships that have just departed Russian ports or headed to Russian ports, it's not crazy to assume that there could be something nefarious afoot. And
You're sort of making it sound like it's not happening quite as much with ships that are going to or coming from non-Russian ports.
yes, that is correct. And there are also some Chinese flagged ships as well coming to and from Russian ports that were involved in a few of these instances. And so that combination, this whole combination of the geopolitical importance of the Baltic, the proximity to Russia, and of course, the suspected activities there really make this strategically significant. I mean, I think in terms of why Americans should care, when these things happen, there's an economic effect that even if you didn't care what Russia did or China for that matter, there is an economic effect. Insurance rates go up, energy prices, and if they go up in Europe, they're going to go up elsewhere. I think what happens in the Baltic doesn't stay in the Baltic. There are secondary and tertiary effects that Americans will feel. It may not be obvious in real time. The good news is there are ways to mitigate this kind of activity. But I think we're at the nascent stage of protecting, monitoring, and defending against this kind of activity.
That sort of leads into, a logical third and final question here, which is what do we do about it? You can't probably be watching every single foot of every single cable or pipeline. You mentioned the challenge of proving intent. The shipping, I guess people probably are monitoring, but particularly where these shadow vessels are concerned, do people have their transponders on or not? And you get into all of that. Boarding somebody else's ship on the high seas kind of raises issues at times. What do we do? How much of it is an American responsibility and something that we should be doing something about? How much of it should the kind of coastal states in the Baltic be taking responsibility for that, maybe with some help from us? Or what's the answer? What's the answer?
Well, I think that the answer is there are several layers and several entities that need to be involved in working together. This needs to be, number one, a public-private endeavor. The private sector actually owns most of the cables. So there is that. Then the power, the
So
power
we need like
elements.
security guards on the bottom of the sea. Sorry.
Well, I think there are some tech companies that are working on not robots, but certainly detection and monitoring, which I think technology is another pillar of this kind of prevention and defense. There are certainly many companies working on this, and to some extent, they're in the defense sector, but at the same time, some of them are just straight up tech. Certainly, the governments. This is a government responsibility because the power grid and data, this is critical infrastructure, which ultimately is a sovereign issue. And we know that those are actually targets in a time of war. NATO actually did act on this. There was an incident in December 2024 in the Baltic, and NATO organized a mission called Baltic Sentry. That actually was relatively effective. It did reduce the number of incidents in 2025, but you can't have a frigate sitting over every single cable that exists or gas pipeline that exists. And then, the technology can help with anomaly detection, and governments and private operators alike can track abnormal vessel behavior like loitering and unusual anchor deployment. There's also redundancy. That's actually one of the key ways to prevent problems is by having multiple cables. If one gets cut, the operator can very quickly switch to another cable for connection. And that's actually cheaper than actually burying these cables deeply under the seabed.
Really?
So yes, so it's you're better off
Wow.
laying a cable
Yeah.
than that. So and
And
then
the cables can't be cheap in any sense that
no,
an ordinary
you're
person, or even an extraordinary person would
no,
would understand as cheap.
no. It requires a huge amount of capital
Right.
to lay these cables, and then finally, shipbuilding has been a big topic in Washington lately, and there's actually a very good reason for it in this particular case, and that is repair capacity. There are ships that exist specifically for cable repairs, but most of them are old. I think they'll all have to be replaced within just a few decades. And not to mention, we don't have enough because think back to the 1990s when the first cables were laid in, I think it was 1850 for telegrams. As technology changed, we had the internet, and now we have just more and more activity, and AI is coming. That's why we actually have even more cables laid in the last 20 years than ever before. And it's just going to grow with AI. So
I'm sorry to interrupt again, but I can't contain myself. I mean, thinking about like not having enough ships to do the repair work, it's making me think like, how long do you have to wait for the cable guy?
right, yes, exactly. Well, apparently for a while, and there's also permitting issues as well. You actually have to get a permit to make the repair in many cases. So that's
This is
another.
like an environmental permit, where I imagine, or
It depends on the regulating country.
hmm,
It's
right. Interesting.
but nonetheless, I think there's security issues at hand as well. But I think both. So that delays even further once you even find a ship that's available to go make the repair. So it's just many layers. There are many components that can be addressed, but it needs to be prioritized.
Thank you very much, Martha. I know I learned a lot, and I hope our listeners did too. Again, this is Paul Saunders, Center for the National Interest, Three Questions podcast with my colleague, Center Senior Fellow for Alliances and Emerging Threats, Martha Miller. Martha, thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
Thank you, Paul.